The study I'm presenting is Intrauterine Cannabis Exposure and Fetal and Maternal Blood Flow, a case control study. The research problem that's being investigated for this study is whether or not there are fetal blood flow and maternal blood flow changes that are occurring throughout the pregnancy of mothers exposed to cannabis. And this is them being exposed to cannabis throughout their pregnancy. And then once determining whether or not there are maternal and fetal blood flow changes, determining whether or not those changes can be specifically attributed to cannabis exposure. The sampling method used for this study is a case-controlled study that is non-experimental in nature. It was conducted over an 8-year period in Barcelona. All of the participants of the study gave birth at Vall d'Hebron Hospital in Barcelona. The study originally was planned to have 297 participants. That changed because at some point the 22 people that were intended for the cannabis group discontinued use of cannabis during their pregnancy, so they dropped out of the study. As a result, the study actually included 275 people, 198 of which were in the control group. Those all included low-risk pregnancies. And then 60 of the people in the cannabis were in the cannabis group. And those were people who continued cannabis use throughout their pregnancy. And 17 people in the study were tobacco users. So we were able to see, or they were able to see, that there were both cannabis and tobacco use and be able to separate those results. Excluded from the study were people with prenatal risk factors and people who were consuming other drugs like opioids or cocaine, alcohol. It should be noted that the cannabis group, those people did self-report as using cannabis, and they were tested during the first trimester, third trimester, or postnatal period in order to detect the presence of THC in their urine. The study findings were that during the third trimester, there's evidence that exposure to cannabis does affect the fetal and maternal blood flow. Specifically, all areas that were affected were uterine artery pressure index, umbilical artery pressure index, and the cerebral placental ratio. Of those things, cannabis was the sole predictor specifically for uterine artery pressure increase and cerebral placental ratio decrease. There were a couple of further research questions raised by this study, one of which was whether or not there was an age bias presented because the women in the cannabis group were all younger than those in the control group, and the tobacco group. There was also the question of whether or not cannabis independently affects the maternal and fetal blood flow because the mothers who were consuming cannabis were also mixing tobacco into that cannabis, although they weren't specifically smoking tobacco exclusively. So there was a question of whether or not it was the vascular changes were attributed to the use of both of those things, and there was that thought process that in the future they would make sure that they didn't that they did something to be able to guard against that sort of bad spot in their research. Additionally, it was recognized that the control group weren't checked for cannabis. It was all on the basis of them self-reporting. And so that can, of course, cause issues with the study also. So those were some weak points that came up that ended up magnifying some further questions that needed to be examined.